The wind screamed like a living thing across the empty wasteland of Colony World Epsilon 7. Red dust pelted the metal walls of Jake Porter's freight depot, making a sound like 1,000 tiny hammers. Inside, Jake was doing what he did every evening, counting boxes, checking manifests, and trying to figure out how to make the numbers work. They never worked anymore. Jake was 32 years old, but the frontier had aged him. His hands were calloused from manual labor, his face lined from squinting against the harsh sun. This depot was all he had left. His father had built it 15 years ago with dreams of a thriving trade hub. Now it was just Jake, fighting to keep the lights on while bigger companies with bigger ships squeezed him out of business. The third foreclosure notice sat on his desk, but he refused to look at it. Epsilon 7 wasn't anybody's first choice. Hell, it wasn't anybody's 10th choice. Humans had settled here because the galactic community didn't want it, just a dusty rock with barely breathable air and nothing valuable beneath the surface. The people who lived here were the ones with nowhere else to go. Failed prospectors, families escaping debt, folks running from past they didn't talk about. They made it work because they had to. The storm outside was getting worse. Jake could hear cargo containers rattling against their anchors. He was about to call it a night when the sensor alarm went off. Something big had just crashed near the landing pad. Jake's heart jumped. Maybe it was a ship in distress. Maybe they'd need repairs, supplies. Maybe he could actually make some money this week. He grabbed his worn jacket and pushed against the depot door. The wind nearly knocked him back inside, but he forced his way out into the storm. The dust was so thick he could barely see 5 feet ahead. His boots crunched on the rocky ground as he made his way toward the landing pad. The sensor said the impact was close, maybe 30 yards out. Through the swirling red clouds, he saw dark shapes near his cargo containers. 2 massive bodies were collapsed on the ground. Dragons. Jake stopped dead in his tracks. Everyone in the galaxy knew about dragons. They were one of the old powers, the kind of species that had been flying between stars when humans were still figuring out fire. They were supposed to be proud, dangerous, and nearly impossible to kill. Jake had seen them on news broadcasts. Magnificent creatures with scales that gleamed like precious metals, wings that could blot out suns. These two looked like death warmed over. Their scales were cracked and dull like old paint peeling off metal. One had wings so torn up that Jake could see straight through the membrane to the bones underneath. They were both thin, ribs showing through their armored hide in a way that looked wrong. Young ones, Jake figured. Maybe teenagers in dragon years, if dragons even aged like that. The bigger one lifted its head. Male, Jake guessed, with dark red scales that might have been beautiful once. Its eyes met Jake's and there was no threat in them. Only fear. Please. The dragon wheezed in broken English. We mean no harm. Jake's mind raced. Dragons were valuable. Really valuable. Black market traders would pay enough for one dragon to clear all his debts and then some. There were stories about what dragon parts could do, scales that could stop bullets, blood that could cure diseases. He could make one call and be rich. He could also get killed the second these things got their strength back. The smart move was to call the colony marshal and let someone else handle it. The safe move was to walk away. Jake had spent his whole life making smart, safe moves, and where had it gotten him? Broke and alone on a worthless planet. But when he looked at those eyes, he didn't see dangerous aliens or potential profit. He saw 2 scared kids who were about to die. Come on, Jake said, walking closer. Let's get you inside before this storm tears you apart. The dragon stared at him like he'd grown a second head. The male tried to push himself up but collapsed immediately. His sister, Jake could see now it was a pair, tried to help him but she was barely in better shape. Her scales were a deep amber color under all the dust and blood. Jake wedged himself under the male dragon's foreleg. The weight was incredible, like trying to lift a small car, but between Jake pushing and the dragon pulling they managed to get him moving. It was slow, painful work. Every few steps the dragon would stumble and Jake's knees would nearly buckle. The female limped behind them, one wing dragging uselessly in the dust. Inside the depot, Jake cleared out the biggest space he had, the cargo bay where he usually stored grain shipments. He grabbed every blanket he owned and made a sort of nest. The dragons collapsed onto it with groans that sounded painfully human. Jake ran to his emergency supplies. He had medical kits meant for humans, but he figured basic first aid was basic first aid. He also grabbed water containers and every food ration he had left. His own stomach would be empty tomorrow, but these two needed it more. The female dragon watched him with wide eyes as he set everything down. "Why would you help us?" she asked. Her voice was clearer than her brother's, but filled with confusion. "We are nothing to you. Strangers. We could be dangerous." Jake was already tearing open a protein pack. You're hungry? I got food. Don't need to make it more complicated than that. We have nothing to pay you with, she insisted. Didn't ask you to pay. Jake pushed the food toward them. Just eat. Rest. We'll worry about everything else later. For 3 days the dragons stayed in Jake's cargo bay. He learned their names between their long periods of sleep. The male was Draker, the female was Ember. They were brother and sister. They told him bits and pieces of their story, something about a war among their people, assassins hunting them, a desperate escape that ended with their ship failing and them crash landing on the first world they could reach. Draker kept trying to give Jake things. He'd pull at his own scales, trying to pry them loose as payment. He'd talk about oaths and debts and honor codes that Jake didn't understand. Jake refused every time. Look, Jake finally said on the third night, where I come from, helping somebody isn't a business deal. You were in trouble. I helped. That's just what decent people do. Draker looked at him for a long moment. You are a strange human, Jake Porter. Yeah, well, you're not the first to say that. On the fourth morning, Jake woke up and walked to the cargo bay with breakfast. It was empty. The blankets were neatly folded. The dragons were gone, vanished sometime in the night without a sound. The only thing they left behind was a single dark red scale on the floor, about the size of Jake's palm, gleaming even in the dim light. Jake picked it up. It was warm to the touch and surprisingly light. He didn't know what it meant, but it felt important. He put it in his pocket, looked at his nearly empty supply shelves and sighed. Life on Epsilon 7 didn't stop for anyone. He had inventory to check and bills to worry about. The dragons were gone. Just another strange day on the frontier. Jake got back to work. 5 years slipped by faster than Jake would have believed possible. Time had a way of doing that on the frontier. One day you were young and full of plans, the next you were watching those plans crumble like dried clay. Jake's freight depot was still standing, but just barely. Every month was the same struggle. The big shipping corporations kept dropping their prices, undercutting him at every turn. They could afford to lose money on routes to Epsilon 7 because they made it back 100 times over on the core worlds. Jake couldn't compete with that. He'd gotten his third foreclosure notice last month, printed on official paper that felt like sandpaper in his hands. But Jake Porter was stubborn. His father used to say it was the family curse, too dumb to know when to quit. So Jake kept going. He moved cargo when there was cargo to move. He fixed machinery when it broke down, which was often in the harsh dust storms. He helped neighbors patch their habitat domes and showed new colonists how to coax water from the recyclers. Epsilon 7 wasn't paradise. It wasn't even nice. But it was home, and the people there were his people. They looked out for each other because the galaxy sure as hell wasn't going to do it for them. When old Tom's oxygen scrubbers failed, everyone pitched in to fix them. When the Harrison family lost their crop to blight, neighbors shared their food without being asked. That's how you survived out here, together. Jake barely thought about the dragons anymore. It had been 5 years since that strange night. Sometimes he'd pull that red scale out of his desk drawer and hold it, wondering what happened to Draker and Ember. He hoped they'd made it home safely. Mostly though, life kept him too busy to dwell on the past. The galaxy had moved on too. News broadcasts, when the satellite array was working, reported that the Dragon Sovereignty Civil War had ended. Some new government had taken over. Dragons were pulling back from galactic politics, closing their borders, becoming mysterious again. It was all distant news that didn't mean much to people scraping by on frontier worlds. Politicians and ancient aliens playing their games while regular folks just tried to make it to next week. Then came the evening that changed everything. It was late autumn on Epsilon 7, which meant the temperature dropped fast after sunset. Jake was doing his end-of-day routine, checking locks, shutting down systems, updating logs that nobody would ever read. He was thinking about the freeze-dried stew waiting for him back at his quarters when the sky lit up. 3 massive shapes appeared in orbit, blocking out the stars. Even from the ground, Jake could see they were enormous warships that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. The design was unmistakable. Organic curves that looked grown rather than constructed, hull plating that resembled scales, weapon ports that glowed with inner fire. Dragon military vessels. Every alarm on Epsilon 7 started screaming at once. Emergency sirens wailed across the colony. People rushed out of their homes in various states of panic, pointing at the sky. Kids started crying. Someone was shouting about an invasion. The colony marshal was trying to get on the radio, his voice cracking with fear. Jake stood frozen in his depot doorway, staring up at those impossible ships. His heart hammered in his chest. In all his years on Epsilon 7, nothing like this had ever happened. Dragons didn't come to places like this. They didn't care about frontier colonies that barely showed up on star charts. A bright light cut through the evening darkness. A shuttle was descending and it was heading straight for Jake's landing pad. "Oh no," Jake whispered. "No, no, no." The shuttle touched down with barely a sound despite its size. The metal was polished to a mirror shine, covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the fading light. For a long moment nothing happened. Jake could hear his own breathing, could feel sweat running down his back despite the cold. Then the boarding ramp lowered with a hiss of hydraulics. Warriors emerged from the shuttle, and they were nothing like the injured refugees Jake had helped 5 years ago. These were soldiers, elite troops, moving with perfect coordination. Their armor wasn't just protective gear, it was art, flowing across their bodies like liquid metal, glowing with subtle energy patterns. Each one carried weapons that hummed with power that made Jake's teeth ache. These were the Royal Dragon Guard, the personal army of the dragon rulers themselves. The lead warrior stepped forward. He was in humanoid form. Dragons could shapeshift, Jake remembered, but there was nothing human about him. He was tall, powerfully built, with eyes that literally glowed like hot coals in the gathering darkness. Those eyes locked onto Jake with laser focus. "Jake Porter," the warrior said. His voice was deep and commanding, speaking perfect English without any accent. "You are summoned. The dragon sovereigns themselves wish to see you. You will come with us now." Jake's mouth went completely dry. His mind went blank for a second, then started racing. "I think maybe you've got the wrong person," he managed to say. "I'm just a freight hauler. Nobody important." "There is no mistake." The warrior's face might as well have been carved from stone. "You will accompany us to the Crown World immediately. This is not a request." Around Jake, colonists had gathered at a safe distance, watching the scene unfold. He could hear their frightened whispers. Mrs. Chen was holding her daughter. Tom was recording everything on his tablet. The marshal looked ready to intervene but smart enough not to try. Jake's thoughts tumbled over each other. What had he done wrong? Was this about Draker and Ember? Had he violated some dragon law by helping them? Were they going to arrest him? Execute him? Make an example out of him? "Am I being arrested?" Jake asked, proud that his voice only shook a little. "No. You are summoned." The warrior gestured toward the shuttle with one armored hand. "There is a difference. But the sovereigns do not wait and neither do we. Please come now." Jake looked back at his depot, the building his father had built with his own hands, the only home Jake had known for years. He looked at his neighbors, people he'd helped and who'd helped him. They looked terrified for him. He didn't have a choice. When the rulers of the dragon sovereignty summoned you, when the royal guard showed up at your door, you didn't say no. You didn't run. You went and you hoped you'd live to tell about it. "Okay," Jake said quietly. "Let me just lock up." "That will not be necessary. Please come now." Jake walked toward the shuttle on legs that felt like rubber. The warriors surrounded him, not threatening but making it clear there was no escape. As he climbed the ramp, he looked back one more time at Epsilon 7, at the only life he'd ever known. The shuttle doors sealed behind him with a sound like a vault closing. The journey through dragon space felt like the longest 4 days of Jake's life. They'd put him in quarters aboard the warship that were nicer than any place he'd ever stayed. The bed was actually comfortable, not like the hard bunk back on Epsilon 7. The walls displayed shifting images of nebulas and distant stars. There was even a food dispenser that produced meals that actually tasted like real food instead of the freeze-dried packets he was used to. Under different circumstances, Jake might have enjoyed it. But he was still a prisoner, even if they were being polite about it. The royal guards checked on him regularly but told him nothing. Every time Jake asked where they were going or why he'd been summoned, they'd give the same answer: "The sovereigns will explain everything." It was maddening. Jake's imagination kept conjuring up worst-case scenarios. Maybe Draker and Ember had gotten in trouble for accepting help from a human. Maybe there was some law about not involving outsiders in dragon affairs. Maybe they were going to make an example of him. He spent hours staring out the viewport, watching systems he'd never heard of slide past. The dragon warship moved impossibly fast, covering distances that would take human ships months. The galaxy looked different from here, bigger, more intimidating. Jake had never felt smaller. On the third day, one of the younger guards came to bring him his meal. Unlike the others, this one seemed less formal, less rigid. His name was Keth, and he looked maybe 20 in human years, though Jake had no idea how dragon aging actually worked. "How long have you been with the Royal Guard?" Jake asked as Keth set down the food tray. Keth paused, surprised. 3 years. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. You got family back home?" The young dragon stared at him like Jake had asked something shocking. Yes. My mother and 2 sisters. They live in the Northern Territories. You must miss them, Jake said, taking a bite of something that tasted like chicken but probably wasn't. Being out here on missions and all. I do, Keth admitted slowly. He seemed unsure whether he should be having this conversation. Most aliens don't ask us such things. Why not? They fear us. Or they want something from us. Protection, technology, favor. You're talking to me like I'm just a regular person. Jake shrugged. That's because you are a person. You've got a family, a job, probably worries and hopes like everyone else. Why would I treat you any different? Keth didn't respond, but something changed in his expression. Over the next day, Jake noticed the other guards acted differently around him too. They started having brief conversations instead of just checking on him silently. They seemed more relaxed, less like he was a dangerous prisoner and more like he was just a passenger. On the 4th day everything changed. Jake woke to find Keth standing at his door. We've arrived, the young guard said. You need to see this. The viewport in Jake's quarters had been showing empty space. Now it displayed a planet that took his breath away. He'd seen pictures of the dragon homeworld in history files, but pictures couldn't capture the reality. The planet was massive, easily 3 times the size of Earth, and covered in colors Jake didn't have names for. The oceans weren't just blue, they shifted between purple and gold. The landmasses looked like someone had painted them with metals, bronze deserts, silver forests, copper mountains. As they descended, Jake could see the cities. They didn't look built, they looked grown like massive crystals erupting from the ground. Towers spiraled up into the clouds, made of materials that caught the sunlight and threw it back in rainbow patterns. Some structures seemed to be alive, slowly shifting shape as he watched. The capital city alone was larger than any human settlement Jake had ever heard of. The sovereign's palace dominated everything. It was less a building and more a mountain that someone had carved into something beautiful and terrifying. Jake could see clouds forming around its highest peaks. Lightning danced between towers. This was a structure so big it created its own weather. Oh man, Jake whispered. I am so out of my depth here. The shuttle landed in a courtyard made of polished black stone that reflected the sky like a mirror. The space was enormous. Jake figured you could fit 100 of his freight depots in there and still have room left over. Royal guards and even fancier armor lined the path, standing perfectly still like statues. They escorted Jake through hallways that made his head spin. The walls were lined with treasures from worlds he'd never heard of, ancient weapons, strange artwork, gems the size of his head. Everything screamed wealth and power beyond imagination. Jake kept his hands in his pockets, afraid to accidentally touch something worth more than his entire colony. Finally, they reached a pair of doors that must have been 50 feet tall. They swung open silently, and Jake's escorts gestured for him to enter alone. The throne chamber was so vast that Jake couldn't see the far walls. The ceiling disappeared into darkness high above. At the far end, on a raised platform, sat 7 dragons in their true forms. They were massive, ancient creatures that radiated power like heat from a furnace. Just being in the same room made Jake want to kneel, to look away, to run. The combined weight of their presence pressed down on him like physical force. But Jake's eyes were drawn to the 2 dragons at the center. They sat in places of highest honor, wearing crowns of metal that seemed to flow like liquid across their heads. The male had scales of deep crimson that gleamed like polished rubies. The female's amber scales caught the light like captured sunlight. They were magnificent, powerful, and absolutely terrifying in their majesty. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He knew those eyes. Draker? Ember? The male dragon's voice filled the entire chamber, resonating in Jake's chest. Jake Porter. You stand before the Dragon Sovereign Council. I am Draker, Crown Prince of the Sovereignty. This is Ember, Crown Princess. 5 years ago, when we were hunted refugees fleeing assassination, you saved our lives. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Crown Prince. Crown Princess. The 2 half-dead refugees he'd fed protein packs and given blankets to were royalty. The rulers of billions. Ember's voice was gentler but no less powerful. You gave without expectation of reward. You asked nothing in return. In our culture, a life debt to the royal family is sacred and eternal. We have summoned you here to repay this debt. Jake's mind was reeling. You don't owe me anything. I just saw 2 people who needed help. Nevertheless, Draker interrupted. He gestured with one massive claw and servants appeared carrying chests. They opened them to reveal treasures that made Jake's eyes water. Precious metals, advanced technology, glowing crystals that probably powered starships. We offer you wealth beyond measure. Technology that could advance humanity 1,000 years. Land, titles, position. Name your price, Jake Porter. Whatever you desire is yours. Jake stared at the fortune laid out before him. With that kind of wealth, he could pay off his depot 100 times over. He could live in luxury for the rest of his life. He could buy his own fleet of ships. But he thought about why he'd helped them in the first place. He'd seen 2 scared kids who needed help. That was it. That was the whole reason. I appreciate the offer, Jake said slowly. But I didn't help you because I wanted something back. I did it because it was the right thing to do. The chamber went dead silent. Jake could feel dozens of eyes on him. One of the elder dragons spoke, his voice filled with disbelief. You refused the sovereign's gift? I don't need all that, Jake explained. If you really want to help me, I could use enough to save my depot and clear my debts. That would be plenty. Ember and Draker exchanged a long look. Something passed between them, some silent communication. Ember spoke softly, but her words carried clearly through the massive chamber. Jake Porter. We did not summon you merely to repay a debt. We summoned you because we need something that only a human can provide. We need you to save our people from destroying themselves. Draker rose from his throne, and Jake watched in amazement as the massive dragon's form rippled and changed. Within seconds he'd shrunk down to something closer to human size, though still impressively tall and powerful looking. He gestured toward a side door that Jake hadn't even noticed. Please, Jake. Let us speak privately. The side chamber was smaller, more personal. The walls were covered with holographic star maps showing territory that stretched across half the galaxy. Different colored zones marked clan territories, trade routes, and strategic positions. But even Jake's untrained eye could see the problems. Red marks indicated disputed borders. Broken lines showed fractured alliances. Entire sections were marked with warning symbols he didn't understand but could guess at. It looked like a map of a civilization tearing itself apart. Ember joined them, having also shifted to a more human-compatible size. Up close, Jake could see the exhaustion in her eyes. These weren't the scared refugees from 5 years ago, but they were carrying a different kind of burden now. The Civil War officially ended 5 years ago, Draker began, his voice heavy. Treaties were signed. Territories were divided. The galaxy thinks we're at peace. He gestured at the maps. But the war never really ended. It just went quiet. Different clans still blame each other for the bloodshed, Ember continued. She touched one section of the map and images appeared, destroyed cities, memorial sites, lists of names that scrolled endlessly. Millions died. Every clan lost people. Everyone has someone to mourn, someone to be angry about. Jake studied the maps, trying to understand the scope of what they were showing him. But you're the rulers now. Can't you just order them to make peace? Draker's laugh was bitter. We are dragons, Jake. We are creatures of pride, honor, and hierarchy. These things are woven into everything we do, everything we are. They define our culture going back thousands of years. And those same things are destroying us, Ember added quietly. Every attempt at negotiation becomes a battle over who bows first, who apologizes, who admits fault. Every peace talk turns into arguments about precedent and protocol. To apologize is to show weakness. To forgive without conditions is to lose face. Our own nature is our prison. Jake was starting to understand, and the picture wasn't pretty. So you're stuck. Worse than stuck, Draker said. The tensions are building. Small incidents are becoming major conflicts. 3 months ago, a trade dispute nearly triggered open warfare between 2 clans. Last month, an honor duel resulted in the death of a clan leader's son. The cycle of revenge and pride is spinning faster. We're heading toward another civil war, and this one will be worse because no one believes peace is possible anymore. Jake felt the weight of what they were telling him settling on his shoulders. Okay, but what does this have to do with me? Ember and Draker exchanged glances. Ember spoke first. We've been watching you, Jake. For 5 years. What? Jake's head snapped up. After we left Epsilon 7, we stationed observers there, Draker explained. Not to spy on you specifically, but to ensure no one came looking for us there, to make sure our presence hadn't put you in danger. But our observers kept reporting back about you. They watched you build community among people who had nothing, Ember said. Colonists who should have been competitors fighting over scraps. Instead, you helped them work together. When Tom's oxygen system failed, you organized everyone to fix it. When the Harrison family lost their crops, you made sure they didn't starve. Draker pulled up different images on the wall, and Jake's stomach dropped. They were surveillance photos of Epsilon 7. There was Jake helping repair a habitat dome. Jake mediating an argument between neighbors about water rights. Jake sharing his own food supplies during a supply ship delay. We watched you settle disputes without demanding formal arbitration or payment, Draker continued. You just sit people down, let them talk, and help them find common ground. No contracts. No elaborate procedures. Just conversation and basic decency. Jake felt violated and confused. You've been spying on me for 5 years? Observing, Ember corrected gently, though she looked apologetic. Jake, please understand. Humans have something we dragons have lost. You can forgive without needing formal apologies. You build trust without requiring contracts or guarantees. You show compassion without expecting anything in return. To us, these seem like impossible things, almost like magic. They're not weaknesses, Draker added. They're strengths we desperately need and don't know how to replicate. The pieces were clicking together in Jake's mind, and he didn't like where this was heading. You want me to do something. We want you to serve as an independent mediator, Draker said directly. A neutral party with no stake in dragon politics, no clan loyalty, no ancient grudges. Someone who operates on principles we've forgotten. Jake actually laughed, though it came out a bit hysterical. You want me, a human freight hauler who can barely keep his own business afloat, to mediate peace between dragon clans that have existed for thousands of years? That's insane. I'm not qualified. I don't know your laws, your customs, your history. You are the only one qualified, Ember interrupted firmly. Dragon diplomats are bound by the same pride and hierarchy that causes our conflicts. They can't escape it because it's who they are. We need someone who sees past all of that. Someone who treats everyone as equals regardless of rank or history. Someone who cares more about solving problems than saving face. What if I fail? Jake asked quietly. What if they won't listen to some random human telling them how to live? Draker's expression went grim. Then millions die in another civil war. Our civilization might not survive it. But if you succeed, you save billions of lives. Jake sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his mind spinning. This was completely insane. He had no business being here, no business trying to solve problems between beings who'd been navigating complex politics since before humans left Earth. But he looked at Draker and Ember, two people he'd helped because it was the right thing to do, and saw the desperate hope in their eyes. They wouldn't ask if they had any other choice. Okay, Jake said finally. I'll try. But I do it my way. No throne rooms. No formal courts. No elaborate protocols or ceremonies. Just conversation. Just people sitting down and talking to each other like people. Agreed, Ember said immediately, relief flooding her face. Completely agreed, Draker added. Over the following weeks, Jake did something unprecedented. He convinced rival dragon clan leaders to meet, not in their grand negotiation chambers with all their formal procedures, but in simple rooms. He served them food himself, shared stories about human history, and asked them to just talk. At first they were insulted. Dragons didn't negotiate over meals like common traders. They certainly didn't take instruction from a species as young and insignificant as humans. But Jake was persistent without being pushy, respectful without being submissive. He listened to their grievances for hours, acknowledged their pain without trying to minimize it, and helped them see each other as people carrying grief rather than just enemies to defeat. The real breakthrough came when Jake organized a shared meal using traditions from Epsilon 7. He told them stories about Earth's history, about wars that nearly destroyed humanity, about the choice people made to rebuild together despite everything. You're all still family, Jake said simply as they ate together. Family fights. Family hurts each other sometimes. But family also forgives. Not because someone makes them, not because a treaty requires it. Because they choose to. Because building something new is better than drowning in old pain. A clan matriarch named Vex spoke first. She'd lost 2 children in the Civil War. Her voice shook as she addressed her rival directly, dropping all formal titles. I blamed you for my daughter's death for 5 years. I wanted revenge. But she chose to fight and you lost sons too. Maybe our children would want us to build something better than endless revenge. It wasn't a perfect moment. There were tears. There was still anger and pain that wouldn't disappear overnight. But it was a start. It was dragons choosing to be more than their pride, more than their grief. And Jake realized that sometimes the bravest thing wasn't fighting, it was choosing to heal. 3 months after Jake first stepped foot on the Crown World, history was made. The dragon sovereignty signed the Unification Accords in a ceremony that was broadcast across the entire galaxy. Jake stood in the background, uncomfortable in the formal clothes they'd made him wear, watching as clan leaders who'd been enemies for decades put their marks on the agreement. Some of them were crying. All of them looked exhausted but hopeful. This wasn't just another peace treaty destined to be broken in a few years. It was a complete reimagining of how dragon society worked. Disputes would be mediated through conversation, not settled through combat or political maneuvering. Pride would be balanced with practical problem-solving. Ancient hierarchies would be respected but not allowed to prevent progress. The part Jake was most proud of was the Council of Remembrance. It was his idea, borrowed from something he'd seen on Epsilon 7 after a mining accident killed 3 colonists. The council would ensure that everyone who died in the Civil War would be honored and remembered. Their names would be spoken aloud every year. Their stories would be preserved. But the living wouldn't be prisoners to that grief. The dead would be remembered, not used as weapons to fuel more hatred. After the ceremony, Draker and Ember called Jake back to the private chamber. The treasures were laid out again, piles of wealth that could buy entire planets. "Name your reward," Draker said formally. "Anything in our power to give is yours." This time Jake had thought about it. He'd spent 3 months watching how Dragon Society worked, understanding their resources and needs. He'd also spent 3 months thinking about home. "Help Epsilon 7, Jake said. "And colonies like it across human space. But not as charity. As partnership." Ember tilted her head, curious. "Explain." "You need raw materials for rebuilding," Jake said, pulling up a holographic display he'd prepared. "Rare minerals, agricultural products, manufacturing capacity. Human frontier colonies have access to all of that, but we don't have the infrastructure or markets to make it profitable. You need what we have. We need what you have. Let's build trade relationships that actually work for both sides." The dragons studied his proposal. It was fair, genuinely fair, not the kind of agreement where one side pretended to benefit while getting exploited. Human colonies would get access to dragon technology, trade networks, and economic stability. Dragons would get reliable resources and trading partners who were grateful rather than resentful. "You could have asked for personal wealth," Draker noted. "Instead you negotiate on behalf of your entire species." Jake shrugged. "Money's only useful if the people around you are doing okay too. I learned that on Epsilon 7. We all rise together or we all sink together." The first Human-Dragon Trade Alliance was signed within a week. Jake personally reviewed every clause, making sure the terms were genuinely fair. Galactic economists were stunned. They'd assumed humanity, as the weaker party, would be pressured into unfavorable terms. Instead, Jake had negotiated one of the most balanced trade agreements in galactic history. News spread through human space faster than the fastest ships could travel. Every news station, every colony broadcast, every social media network was talking about Jake Porter. One ordinary freight operator from a backwater colony had prevented a galactic war. He'd secured humanity's first major alliance with an ancient power. And he'd done it not through threats or manipulation, but through simple human decency. The galactic community, which had barely noticed humanity for centuries, suddenly couldn't ignore them anymore. Humans weren't the strongest species, there were dozens stronger. They weren't the smartest. Several species had been spacefaring for millennia longer. They weren't long-lived like the dragons or technologically advanced like the synthetic races. But Jake Porter had proven something the galaxy had forgotten. Kindness was its own form of strength. The ability to forgive, to build trust, to see people as people rather than as obstacles or tools. These weren't weaknesses. They were powers that could reshape civilizations. Within months, other species started requesting human mediators for their own conflicts. Humanity's reputation across the galaxy shifted almost overnight. They went from being dismissed as insignificant newcomers to being valued as peacemakers and bridge builders. It wasn't the reputation humanity had been trying to build through military expansion or technological achievement. It was something better. Jake could have stayed on the Crown World. The dragons offered him everything. Estates that spanned continents, positions of high honor in their government, access to technology and knowledge that would make him one of the most powerful humans alive. Other alien dignitaries wanted him to mediate their conflicts. He received offers of wealth and influence from across the galaxy. He turned down every single one. "I appreciate everything you're offering," Jake told Draker and Ember. "But I've got a depot to run back home." They didn't argue. Maybe they understood better than anyone that Jake Porter was who he was because of where he came from, because of the life he'd chosen. You couldn't transplant him into palaces and power without changing the very thing that made him special. Draker and Ember personally escorted him home in a royal vessel that drew stares from every ship they passed. When they landed on Epsilon 7, the entire colony was waiting. They'd watched the news broadcasts. They'd seen their neighbor, the quiet guy who fixed their broken equipment and shared his food during shortages, become someone the entire galaxy was talking about. Jake stepped off the shuttle and was immediately mobbed by people wanting to shake his hand, hug him, hear the stories firsthand. Old Tom was crying. The Harrison kids were jumping up and down with excitement. Even the colony marshal, who'd never liked Jake much, looked impressed. Speech, someone yelled and others took up the chant. Jake held up his hands, embarrassed. I'm just glad to be home. And I've got good news, we're about to become the first official human-dragon trade hub. Which means jobs, which means money, which means we can finally fix that water recycler that's been giving us trouble. They laughed and cheered. That was Jake. Even after reshaping galactic politics, he was thinking about the broken water recycler. True to the agreement, Jake's freight depot became the primary hub for human-dragon trade. Ships began arriving regularly, bringing goods, technology, and opportunities. Epsilon 7 transformed from a struggling backwater into a thriving colony. But Jake stayed the same, still helping neighbors, still mediating disputes over property lines and noise complaints, still refusing to act like he was anyone special. 6 months after returning home, another storm rolled across Epsilon 7. Jake was closing up the depot when his sensors picked up something near the landing pad. His heart jumped, part nostalgia, part concern. He grabbed his jacket and headed out into the wind and dust. A figure was collapsed near his cargo containers. Not a dragon this time. This one had multiple limbs and a carapace that gleamed even under the dust. A trill, one of the insectoid species from the outer rim. They were refugees now, fleeing persecution from a neighboring species. The colonists had gathered, watching from their doorways. They all knew what this moment meant. They were watching to see if Jake Porter was really who the galaxy said he was, or if helping the dragons had been a one-time thing. Jake didn't hesitate even for a second. He walked over to the collapsed trill, knelt down beside them and spoke gently. Hey there. You're safe now. Let's get you inside and warmed up. The trill's multifaceted eyes focused on him with confusion and desperate hope. You help me? Why? Jake smiled, the same smile he'd given Draker and Ember 5 years ago. Because you need help. Come on. He helped the trill to their feet and guided them toward the depot. Behind him, he could hear the colonists starting to move. Someone was getting medical supplies, someone else was preparing food, others were making space. They'd learned from Jake's example. This was what Epsilon 7 did now. This was what humanity did. Later that night, after the trill was settled and sleeping, Jake stood outside his depot looking up at the stars. The galaxy was different now, or maybe it was just starting to understand what it had been missing. Humanity had proven they had something valuable to offer. Not weapons or technology or resources, but something more fundamental. Compassion. The willingness to help without demanding payment. The ability to see suffering and respond to it simply because it was the right thing to do. Jake thought about everything that had happened. 2 refugees in a storm, 5 years of watching and waiting, 3 months of impossible mediation, and now a galaxy that was slowly learning to care again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. More ships would arrive. More trade agreements would need attention. More people would need help. Jake would face it all the same way he always had, with quiet decency, stubborn kindness, and the bone-deep belief that people were worth helping simply because they were people. The depot lights flickered off one by one. Jake headed home, tired but content. It was, after all, the human way.